Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant, Part 5, Victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1863. We stopped last time in 1862. General Grant had won major victories in Tennessee at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Shiloh. He was having a lot of problems with infighting jealous generals who were trying to take him down. But he received tremendous help from his friend William Tecumseh Sherman, and of course President Lincoln's support was crucial. He was fighting, as all of the Union troops were fighting, not only the Confederate Army, but the people of the South, who, the large majority, supported the Confederate Army and were taking actions in support, including sabotage. In 1862, General Grant said, quote, "I told the inhabitants of Mississippi that if they allowed their sons and brothers to remain within my lines and receive protection, and then during the night sneak out and burn my bridges and shoot officers, I would desolate their country for 40 miles around every place where it occurred. This put an end to bridge burning." There was a march toward Vicksburg, which was this important fort, which was keeping the Union from total control of the Mississippi River. After 5 weeks, the Union troops reached Grenada, Mississippi. At the same time, Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided to invade the North. He entered Maryland. The people of Maryland were not happy. The Confederate Army was shoeless, unwashed, and filthy. What followed was the Battle of Antietam Creek, September 17th. There were 20,000 casualties. It was the deadliest day in American history. Lee retreated south. The Union celebrated. However, Union General George McClellan did not follow up with an attack on Lee's army to destroy his army. He missed his chance. This was a bitter blow to President Lincoln, and that meant the end of the career of George McClellan. On the eve of Antietam, Great Britain and France considered recognizing the Confederacy, but after the victory of Antietam, they no longer did so. The Emancipation Proclamation was scheduled for January 1st of 1863. Slaves were coming to Grant's army, and these black people were needed to help. They were sick and hungry and nearly naked. They needed shelter, employment, and to be prepared for freedom. They needed education and medical care. Grant's dealings dealt with these black people. This was important work. Black men were used to build bridges and roads and earthworks and chop wood for steamers. The women worked in kitchens and hospitals. The black men were being prepared to be soldiers and to vote. Grant established a contraband camp at Grand Junction, Tennessee. Blacks were allowed to work the abandoned cotton plantations, growing cotton and corn to support the war effort. They lived in comfortable cabins there at Grand Junction, Tennessee. They built hospitals. Army commanders were given field details to care for the recently enslaved. Frederick Douglass admired Grant's work with black Americans, giving them food, work, medical care, and education. In the fall of 1862, there were elections held, and the Democrats won. Republicans were hurt by the issue of emancipation. The Union war effort in Virginia was a disaster. The Army of the Potomac, President Lincoln replaced General McClellan with Ambrose Burnside. McClellan was arrogant, but Burnside was in over his head. He lacked self-confidence. Lincoln continued to be cursed by poor generals in the East. December 13th was the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia. Burnside attacked, but it was a suicidal attack. There were 13,000 Union soldiers killed or wounded. This was a disaster. January 25th, 1863, President Lincoln replaced Burnside with Joe Hooker, who also failed. Union failures in the East opened the way for Grant's eventual arrival to take over. November of 1862, Grant was moving south on the Mississippi Railroad, getting closer to Vicksburg. He had a 190-mile railroad supply line. He arrived in Oxford, Mississippi, surrounded by the enemy. Oxford, Mississippi was the Yale of the South, but it became a vast army camp. Grant was deep in the land of cotton and fighting the cotton trade. There was a demand for cotton in the North, which financed the Confederacy, trading with the enemy. There was corruption. Army officers were being paid bribes to facilitate cotton smuggling. On December 17th, Grant issued an order expelling Jewish people from the Mississippi River because of cotton smuggling. And this became very controversial and still is today. There are those who are against Grant for this reason. Grant's wife, Julia, was being mistreated by his sisters. In Galena, Illinois, November 23rd, Grant wrote an angry letter to his father. His father, Jesse, hoped to profit from the cotton trade. Grant shipped north the Mack brothers, who had business dealings with his father, Jesse. Grant was upset about Jesse's actions. Jewish leaders went to the White House to protest to Abraham Lincoln the order removing all Jewish people from the Mississippi River. And Grant revoked this anti-Jewish order. April of 1862, New Orleans had fallen to the Union. Vicksburg was the last obstacle on the Mississippi River. It was also a railroad hub. Vicksburg became the major goal. General John McClernand, a war Democrat, tried to destroy Grant with stories of that Grant was an alcoholic. And McClernand was given a role to take Vicksburg. On October 7, 1862, McClernand said he wanted an independent command in the West, and President Lincoln accepted that request. Grant and McClernand were competing to take Vicksburg. On December 8th, Grant told Sherman to travel on the Mississippi River and attack Vicksburg. In mid-December, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate raider, attacked Union forces in western Tennessee. He destroyed railroad and telegraph lines. On December 20th, Earl Van Dorn and the Confederates attacked the Union supply depot at Holly Springs, torched millions of rations and cotton, and captured 1,500 troops. Grant needed to supply the Army with local sources. On December 29th, Sherman attacked Vicksburg. This was a Union defeat. There were 1,800 Union casualties, and Sherman accepted blame for the defeat. January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln released the Emancipation Proclamation, in which all slaves would become free in the rebel states. So when the Union Army arrived, they would be free. The war became something to end slavery and preserve the Union. The war became more ferocious, total war. Grant said that the war was divine punishment for slavery, a sin against God's laws, that all men are brothers. He recruited black soldiers. On January 10th, Grant moved his headquarters to Memphis, Tennessee. Vicksburg became the war's biggest headache. It was located at a hairpin bend in the river, a bottleneck for traffic on the Mississippi. There were cliffs, ravines, bayous, and a delta with snakes, alligators, and bears. Very challenging geography. President Lincoln said, quote, "Vicksburg is the key." Midwest farmers needed to open the Mississippi so they could get their crops to market in the east, from the Mississippi down to the Gulf of Mexico and over to the East Coast. At Vicksburg, the Confederate general was John Pemberton. He had 30,000 troops. In late January, Grant was at Young's Point, Louisiana, 20 miles from Vicksburg. There was severe flooding. Union troops were getting sick. The dead were buried in the levee. Soldiers were sleeping a foot above their buried comrades. Grant hoped to attack Vicksburg from the east on dry land. Ulysses S. Grant worried about his idle, miserable troops, so he felt they needed projects that might help the war effort. They dug canals around Vicksburg using gunboats and 4,000 black workers. A dam collapsed because of rain. There was failure. A second project was Yazoo Pass, a backdoor entrance. Different projects failed. There was criticism of Grant. The Army was stuck in the mud. It was a winter like Valley Forge, and Grant was receiving more criticism for his failure to take Vicksburg, Mississippi. President Lincoln said that regardless of stories of his drinking, Grant was successful. President Lincoln was wise and strong. He opposed Grant's critics. President Lincoln said, quote, "I think Ulysses S. Grant has hardly a friend left except myself. What I want is generals who will fight battles and win victories. General Grant has done this, and I propose to stand by him." Charles Dana, the Assistant Secretary of War, arrived at Grant's camp at Milliken's Bend, north of Vicksburg, on April 6, 1863. Grant had a big army up and down the Mississippi River bank. Secretary of War Stanton sent Dana to investigate stories of Grant's drinking. Dana and Grant became friends. In Dana's report, he called Grant sober, modest, humble, and honest, friendly. He enjoyed humor, and he also enjoyed long conversations in the evening. Charles Dana wrote about Grant, quote, "Ulysses S. Grant is an uncommon fellow, the most disinterested and the most honest man I ever knew, with a temper that nothing could disturb. He is sincere, thoughtful, deep, and gifted with courage that never faltered. He is a social, friendly man, too, fond of a pleasant joke, liking above all a long chat of an evening." Dana was invited to stay with Grant and the Army and became a good friend. Grant pursued a circuitous approach to Vicksburg. There were natural barriers. It was a riddle. It required all-consuming concentration. There were obstacles to reach the enemy and fight him. On April 1st, Grant gave up the indirect moves to Vicksburg, which had failed. President Lincoln was worried about Grant taking Vicksburg and was waiting for news. Grant decided on a bold move. He would run gunboats past Vicksburg at night and establish a beachhead south of the city. March 25th, Grant ran 2 steam trams past Vicksburg. The Switzerland was okay. However, the Lancaster was destroyed by artillery fire. Grant's strategy was to march troops on the west bank of the Mississippi River and ferry them across the river, live off the land, take the state capital of Jackson. It was questionable whether a large army could live off the land, but Grant was confident. Navy Rear Admiral David D. Porter was in charge of the gunboats and had good rapport with Ulysses S. Grant. April 16th, Grant, Julie, and their children at 10 p.m. were on the upper deck of a steamer witnessing a historic event. 7 ironclads and 1 wooden gunboat, 3 transports in single file sailed past Vicksburg. These were ironclad turtles, steamboats, barges. The boilers' decks were packed with hay, logs, and cotton bales, and sacks of grain and sandbags to absorb fire. The Vicksburg's cannons could ignite them. This would be terrible. These ships were during the night passed by every half hour. The flotilla hugged to the east shore, closer to Vicksburg. The shore batteries overshot them. There were 525 discharges, only 68 direct hits. The steamer Henry Clay went down in flames. Other ships were slightly damaged. It was successful. 14 wounded, no one killed. Grant rode his horse south to see the shape of the ships. On April 22nd, 6 more steamers and 12 barges at night traveled past Vicksburg. Grant concluded the Army was not able to transport supplies on the road on the west side of the river. Transports with 100,000 rations and 40 days' supply of coal passed on the river. This was successful. 1 steamer was destroyed, 2 were damaged, nobody was killed. Grant rode to Grand Gulf below Vicksburg to meet with Porter. This was the place Grant hoped to launch a massive invasion of the Mississippi interior. The next stage was the march of the Army down the western Mississippi, starting at Milliken's Bend. It was difficult. The land was underwater except for strips of land behind levees. It was stormy weather. There were alligators in nearby bayous. The soldiers would sink in the mud. It took 18 horses to remove a heavy gun from the muck. The soldiers were dirty and muddy. They were building roads, draining swamps, taking wood from houses and barns for the roads. Grant helped working to build the roads. After maddening months of doomed canal projects, Grant was happy with this movement. The Grant mystique was get things done. There was no Napoleonic posturing. Grant's genius was he had energy. He was in his element. April 27th, General McClernand. It was in Hard Times, Louisiana, near Grand Gulf. General McPherson also, with 2/3 of Grant's army. Early in the war, Grant was frustrated with the prowess of the Confederate cavalry. Now he wanted to show that the Union cavalry was strong. General Benjamin Grierson led a bold cavalry raid in eastern Mississippi. On April 17th in LaGrange, Tennessee, 1,700 horse soldiers traveled 600 miles in 16 days. They captured 500 rebel soldiers, destroyed 50 miles of railroad track. This was like the work of Nathan Bedford Forrest. They had given the Confederates a taste of their own medicine. On April 29th, Admiral Porter with 8 gunboats pounded the Confederate batteries at Grand Gulf, 40 miles south of Vicksburg. This was unsuccessful. Grant took 10,000 men and transports down the river. He decided to run transports down the river past Grand Gulf like Vicksburg. This was successful. Then the army crossed the river from west to east. Grant decided to attack Jackson, Mississippi, the state capital. He would attack Jackson and then come back and attack Vicksburg. On May 1st, he took Fort Gibson and was living off the land. Local food was taken for the soldiers: hams, chickens, mutton, bacon, molasses, sweet potatoes, corn, and strawberries. Grant protected the women and children from the army. Grant shared his soldiers' hardships by marching with them and sleeping on the damp ground. The morale of the men was high. His 12-year-old son, Fred, was there and crossed the river on a gunboat. On May 3rd, Grant ordered a train with 120 wagons with rations, 100,000 pounds of bacon, and the balance in coffee, sugar, salt, and hard bread. Fred, his son, was in an active war zone. He wanted to toughen his son, Fred. On May 3rd, Union forces were at Grand Gulf, which had been evacuated by Pemberton. Grant went into the interior of Mississippi and lived off the land. He destroyed corn and wheat crops to weaken the South. On May 7th, General Sherman's army crossed the Mississippi River and went on a high-speed march to Jackson, losing communication with Washington, D.C. and the outside world. There was a need to fight the enemy before the rations failed. On May 11th, the Union took Raymond, Mississippi. Grant wanted to isolate and starve Vicksburg. He needed to destroy the railroad link between Vicksburg and Jackson. On May 9th, the War Department in Richmond, from Richmond, the Confederacy, Joe Johnston was in charge to defend the state of Mississippi and Jackson. The Confederates were outnumbered there, and Johnston withdrew. May 14th, Jackson fell. Grant stayed in Jackson in the finest brick hotel. He stayed in the room that Johnston had been in the night before. Grant's army celebrated taking Jackson, Mississippi. Poor whites and blacks looted the stores. Johnston set fire to storehouses. There was no food. Grant issued 200,000 rations to prevent starvation in Jackson. He burned the cotton mill, which was making tent cloth for the Confederate army. He destroyed arsenals and machine shops and foundries and factories. Grant and the Union Army fought Pemberton, the Confederates at Champion's Hill. The Confederates had 20,000 troops and the Union 29,000. This was a Union victory at Champion's Hill, Mississippi. The Confederates had 2,000 casualties and lost 3,000 prisoners. Union had heavy losses. It was a bloody victory. Vicksburg was isolated. Grant could see the horror of battle, the dead, mutilated bodies. May 17th, Grant was 10 miles from Vicksburg. There was the Battle of Big Black River. This was another Union victory. General Michael Lawler led a bold attack of 2,000 and took 2,000 prisoners. Grant's son, Fred, had a bullet graze his leg. The Vicksburg campaign continued after Grant took Jackson, Mississippi. Pemberton attacked, and then there was fighting and retreated back to Vicksburg. Grant said, quote, "While a battle is raging, one can see his enemy mowed down by the 1,000 or 10,000 with great composure. But after the battle, these scenes are distressing, and one is naturally disposed to do as much as possible to alleviate the suffering of an enemy as of a friend." Union soldiers tended to wounded Confederate troops. At Big Black River, the Confederates had 1,700 killed and captured. Union 280 killed and wounded. After 3 weeks, Grant was and his men spent 130 miles marching on foot. There were 5 battles in western Mississippi. The freed slaves were celebrating. Vicksburg and Pemberton were preparing for a siege. On May 18th, Grant had 50,000 soldiers encircling Vicksburg. There were 31,000 Confederate soldiers trapped inside. On May 19th, Grant and Sherman were at Haynes Bluff on a high plain north of Vicksburg, where the place that Sherman had failed to take the previous November. Pemberton yielded the high ground of Haynes Bluff. Joe Johnston advised Pemberton that if he lost Haynes Bluff, he should evacuate Vicksburg. Pemberton ignored the advice. He paid a high price. Vicksburg became a death trap. On May 19th, Grant ordered an assault on Vicksburg, which failed. There were 1,000 Union casualties. Confederates lost 200. On May 22nd, there was a second attack at Vicksburg. Grant worried about the effect of the heat on Union troops and the drinking of dirty drinking water, which led to death by dysentery. The second assault at Vicksburg, Porter had his gunboats involved. This was a failure. There were 3,200 Union casualties, a disaster. There was a misleading report from General John McClernand. He claimed that he captured 2 forts. It was false. He requested troops. Grant dispatched troops, and half the day's casualties resulted. Grant's conclusion was that McClernand was unfit for command. On May 22nd assault in Cold Harbor, Virginia, were Grant's most regretted decisions. After the second assault, there was a problem of dead bodies. On May 25th, Pemberton suggested a 2.5-hour ceasefire to remove the decomposing bodies in the strong sunlight. Also, the wounded soldiers. The rebels were gagging from the stench of the corpses. Grant decided on a siege. He needed trenches for artillery. There was a danger of rebel marksmen that would hit Union soldiers, and they were afraid of digging these trenches. So Grant himself got into the digging, exposing himself to danger, shaming the men to show courage and dig. There was a fear that Confederate General Joe Johnston would come and lift the siege. Grant sent Sherman to stop Johnston. Johnston to Confederate War Secretary James A. Seddon. The Union Army had 60 to 80,000 troops, worth doubly the Eastern Union troops. President Lincoln's faith in Grant was rewarded. Joe Hooker was involved in the Chancellorsville, which became a disaster in the East, was replaced by Joe Meade. Grant was waiting to take Vicksburg to relieve General McClernand. John Rawlins continued to be Grant's most valuable staff officer. Johnston wanted to take Yazoo City. Grant investigated with a steamer on the Yazoo River. On June 9th, Grant invited Julia and the children to come for the siege of Vicksburg. Julia came and helped with her kindness, solving grievances with the officers. Vicksburg was blasted into submission with 70,000 troops. The Union troop challenges were malaria, salt pork, no vegetables, the hot sun, and dirty drinking water. Grant constantly fraternized with troops. Grant was respected for his humility, kindness, and competence. Pemberton hoped that Johnston would come. Johnston said that Vicksburg was hopeless and did not come. Grant hoped that Johnston would come. He was confident and said, quote, "That will give us 30,000 more prisoners than we now have, in addition to the 30,000 expected to be taken at Vicksburg." President Lincoln in Washington, D.C. was anxious for news from Vicksburg. The siege of Vicksburg, a private in the 4th Minnesota Regiment, saw an older Union soldier in a rumpled uniform standing atop an observation tower near the front and said, "Say, you old bastard, you better keep down from there or you will get shot." The man paid no attention. The Minnesota man shouted again, and his captain said, quote, "That's General Grant." The Confederate soldiers and people in Vicksburg were starving. Cats, dogs, and rats had disappeared. Many had scurvy. In late June, half the people were sick. The people dug caves in the hillsides, seeking shelter from the artillery bombardment. The people still had hope that Johnston would come. During the siege, enormous numbers of runaway slaves came to Grant's camp. Several 100,000 slaves were liberated by Grant's army. The freed slaves were given work, digging trenches and destroying railroad tracks. This was important. Grant embraced the policy of General Halleck on March 30th, 1863, that freed slaves were to be given work and prepared to become soldiers. In late March, President Lincoln sent General Lorenzo Thomas to Grant to confer about the freed blacks. By the end of 1863, there were 20,000 black troops in black regiments. Grant supported Chaplain John Eaton, superintendent of the Mississippi Valley, who was providing education, shelter, medical care, and employment in the contraband camps for freed slaves who were battling disease, despair, and death. President Lincoln liked Grant. He was successful in battle and supported freedom for the slaves. At Davis Bend, Mississippi, a river peninsula 25 miles south of Vicksburg, Jefferson Davis's brother owned a huge slave plantation there, and he fled in 1862. The slaves invaded the mansion, dividing the clothing and furniture, and operated the plantation. Grant supported them. It became a model community for black people. At Davis Bend, the land was leased to freedmen. They were paid government rations and given mules and tools. The men worked the cotton fields, the women the vegetable gardens. They sold their produce to steamboat traffic on the Mississippi River. The residents showed skill and enterprise. They built a church and schoolhouse, an infirmary for orphans and the elderly. By 1865, at Davis Bend was producing 2,000 bales of cotton worth $16,000 and a $16,000 profit. On June 7th, at Milliken's Bend on the Mississippi River, Confederate General John Walker and 2,000 Texas troops attacked the Union supply depot. There were 1,000 Union troops, mostly black. Jeff Davis said that the blacks in the Union Army should be returned to their owners and hung as criminals. The Confederate soldiers were furious that there were blacks in the Union Army. This was a Union victory at Milliken's Bend, which honored blacks everywhere and proved that black troops could be effective. Grant was impressed by those black troops at Milliken's Bend and was dedicated to end slavery. Grant believed that black troops were needed to win the war and weaken the Confederacy and strengthen the Union. Black soldiers in the Union Army were paid less until June of 1864 than white soldiers. They gained pride in political standing, leadership skills. In late June, Grant continued to pummel Vicksburg. Confederate General at Vicksburg John Pemberton was a Yankee. His two brothers were in the Union Army. He was a Pennsylvania native, went to West Point, married a woman from Virginia, and embraced the Confederacy. Pemberton did not want to abandon Vicksburg and save the army. He feared he would be charged with treason, so he stayed at Vicksburg, and partly because of his northern background. Pemberton hoped to surrender to the Union on July 4th. Grant provided lenient terms. The soldiers at Vicksburg were close to mutiny. On July 3rd, the Confederates at Vicksburg raised white flags. There was a ceasefire. General John Brown and Colonel Lewis Montgomery approached Union lines. Brown was an old friend of Grant, and they negotiated. Grant's terms were unconditional surrender. Grant wrote a letter to Pemberton, and he wrote, quote, "Men who have shown so much endurance and courage as those now in Vicksburg will always challenge the respect of an adversary. And I can assure you, you will be treated with all the respect due to prisoners of war." Vicksburg surrendered. Union soldiers gave food to the Confederate soldiers. The Union soldier from Wisconsin wrote, quote, "It was good to see them eat. We could never remember anything that gave us greater pleasure than the eagerness of the rebels to get a drink of coffee. Many of us did not sleep at all that night, talking with the prisoners." Grant decided to parole the Confederate soldiers at Vicksburg and send them home, 30,000 prisoners. If they were taken as prisoners, they would tie up Union soldiers who were needed to fight. By being paroled, they agreed to go home and not fight again. Most of them did not fight again. Pemberton accepted the surrender terms. The officers were allowed to keep their sidearms and clothing and one horse each. July 4th was victory at Vicksburg. There was a ceremony to stack arms. The Union did not gloat. There was respect. There was no cheering. The Union soldiers were sad to see the dejected Confederate soldiers. Grant was happy to capture and not kill Confederate soldiers. The stars and stripes were raised at Vicksburg. The city was one vast cemetery. There were skulls and limbs buried. There were skulls and limbs of buried soldiers protruding from the earth. The Union and Confederate soldiers gazed at each other in wonder. The Union soldiers were prosperous and the Confederates haggard. They mingled quickly because of their common nationality. Pemberton was arrogant. Grant was patient and courteous and dignified. He understood the ego of a defeated man. July was victory at Vicksburg. President Lincoln said, quote, "The father of waters," in other words, the Mississippi River, "again goes unvexed to the sea." President Lincoln said, quote, "Ulysses S. Grant is my man, and I am his the rest of the war." President Lincoln said, quote, "Grant doesn't worry and bother me. He isn't shrieking for reinforcements all the time. He takes what troops we can safely give him and does the best he can with what he has got." Pemberton was reduced in rank to lieutenant colonel and became a scapegoat in the South. Most of the men did go home and did not violate their parole. Grant was humble. After the surrender, he got a haircut. One of his aides tried to shove a Lieutenant Frank Parker from a chair in the barber shop to make room for Grant, and Grant insisted on waiting his turn. On July 9th, Port Hudson, south of Vicksburg, fell to Union General Nathaniel Banks, and there were 7,000 prisoners. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.